Thermal scope, cold metal, a gully squeezed between two slag mountains. The drone operator, callsign Rook 9, 28th Mechanized Brigade, was watching his screen at 6:14 local time when the first BMP-3 nosed around the eastern spoil tip and entered the kill corridor. He didn't reach for a launch trigger, he reached for his radio. Because this moment had been planned for weeks. Every centimeter of that gully had already been registered. Every choke point had a fire mission number. The Ukrainians had done something the Russian assault planners apparently hadn't. They had looked at the terrain map and understood that the column entering that gully had exactly one way in and no way out. Within 90 minutes, 14 BMP-3 hulls would be burning across a 1.2-kilometer stretch of coal haul track. Not because Ukrainian forces were lucky, because they had turned a predictable Russian assault axis into a textbook kill sack, and because the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade drove into it anyway. This was the third time Russian forces had attempted to force this exact gully east of Toretsk in 2026. The outcome was the same as the first two attempts. The reasons were identical, and that repetition, that doctrinal blindness, is what this reconstruction is really about. Stay with us for the next 30 minutes, because what happened in that gully on the morning of May 31st, 2026, is not a simple tactical story. It is a case study in how Ukrainian units are now systematically converting Russian predictability into destruction, and why the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade's commanders may have known the risks and ordered the assault anyway. The Toretsk direction has been one of the grinding axes of the Donetsk front since Russian forces began pushing through the Vuhledar corridor in late 2024. By early 2026, the front line east of Toretsk had stabilized along an irregular arc running through former industrial infrastructure. Coal processing facilities, conveyor mounds, slag-tip networks laid down over 6 decades of Soviet mining operations. This terrain is unlike anything in conventional military doctrine manuals. The spoil tips, known locally as terracon, rise 15 to 40 meters above the surrounding flatland. Between them, compressed service tracks, drainage channels, and equipment haul roads create narrow corridors that heavy armor can navigate only in single file or at most 2 vehicles abreast. OSINT geolocation of drone footage published by Ukrainian military sources places the specific assault axis along a coal haul service track running approximately northwest to southeast, squeezed between 2 of these industrial spoil tips roughly 2 kilometers east of the Toretsk urban boundary. The track is approximately 8 meters wide at its narrowest choke point. A BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle is 3.15 meters wide, which means 2 vehicles can pass barely, but cannot maneuver once committed. The flanks on both sides are the slag tips themselves, loose, unstable, 40-degree slopes covered in compacted coal waste. No wheeled or tracked vehicle can climb them under fire. No infantry element can sprint up them in daylight without being cut down. This is the terrain the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade chose as their assault axis in the spring of 2026. And according to Ukrainian General Staff reporting and OSINT analysis from multiple sources, including monitoring groups tracking the Donetsk front, this was not the first time. The first documented Russian attempt to force this gully occurred in late January 2026. A smaller column, assessed at 8 to 10 vehicles, entered the corridor and encountered pre-positioned Ukrainian anti-tank teams. 3 vehicles were destroyed before the column reversed. The second attempt came in March 2026, with a larger force that attempted a sequential push, vehicle by vehicle, after a preparatory artillery barrage on the ridgeline. That attempt also failed. 2 vehicles were destroyed at the lead. The remainder withdrew under FPV drone pressure. By May 2026, Russian forces in the Toretsk sector were under significant operational pressure. The broader axis toward the western districts of Toretsk represented one of the few locations where Russian command assessed mechanized momentum might still be achievable, given the degree to which Ukrainian defensive engineering had hardened alternative approaches. The slag-belt Gully, despite its history of failed assault attempts, remained on Russian operational planning documents as a viable mechanized corridor, apparently because its width technically accommodated armor and because the approaches to it were less exposed to Ukrainian long-range fires than the open ground to the north and south. Here's what strikes anyone who studies this sector carefully. The Gully wasn't a secret route. Ukrainian forces knew it was there. Russian forces knew Ukrainian forces knew, and yet the third assault was ordered anyway. We'll come back to why that decision may have been made, because the answer says something uncomfortable about how Russian operational planning works under conditions of command pressure. The 28th Mechanized Brigade had been holding positions in the Toretsk sector for several months prior to the May 31st engagement. According to Ukrainian military reporting, the brigade's forward observer teams had spent weeks precisely registering fire on the Gully's key terrain features, pre-attack staging imagery, portions of which circulated in OSINT channels in the days following the engagement, shows drone survey work covering both entry points of the corridor at high resolution. Individual trees, drainage pipes, and sections of track embankment are visible and identifiable. The fire control logic the 28th Brigade applied was methodical. Forward observers identified 4 primary choke points within the 1.2-kilometer stretch: the eastern entry curve around the spoil tip, a drainage crossing approximately 400 meters in, a track narrows where an old conveyor foundation encroaches on the road surface, and the western exit point where the corridor opens back into marginally wider terrain. Each of these points was registered with specific fire mission coordinates and assigned a weapon system priority. The eastern entry was designated for anti-tank minefields laid under cover of darkness. The drainage crossing and the conveyor narrows were assigned to Stugna-P anti-tank guided missile teams, positioned on a covered reverse-slope ridgeline approximately 800 meters south. The western exit was covered by FPV drone teams with specific instructions to target recovery vehicles attempting to extract damaged armor. The Stugna-P is a Ukrainian-produced laser beam-riding ATGM capable of engaging targets at ranges up to 5,500 meters. It fires from a concealed position, requires no active radar signature, and generates minimal acoustic signature at launch compared to systems like the American TOV. The guidance system tracks the missile via a rear-mounted sensor and a laser beam projected from the operator's unit, meaning the operator does not need to be on exposed high ground. The warhead, a tandem-shaped charge, is designed specifically to defeat explosive reactive armor of the type fitted to BMP-3 variants in Russian service. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, subsequently analyzed by multiple OSINT monitoring groups, showed Russian assembly of an armored column in a staging area approximately 3 kilometers east of the Gully entry point, beginning the evening of May 30th. The column included approximately 20 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, assessed to belong to the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade based on unit markings visible in pre-assault drone footage. Several vehicles in staging imagery were identified by bort numbers, hull identification codes that matched vehicles previously photographed in Russian positions in the broader Donetsk sector, providing a documented link to the specific unit. The BMP-3 is Russia's most capable infantry fighting vehicle in current service. It mounts a 100mm low-pressure gun, a coaxial 30mm autocannon, and 3 machine guns, and can carry up to 7 infantrymen in its troop compartment. In the assault configuration used at Toretsk, the vehicles were assessed as carrying infantry loads, meaning each hull represented not just a vehicle kill, but a potential infantry casualty event if the troop compartment was occupied during strike. The BMP-3 BMP-3 entered Soviet and then Russian service in 1987 and has been progressively upgraded. The variants observed in this engagement included at least some with cage armor and improvised overhead protection against FPV strikes, modifications that have become near universal in Russian armored formations since 2023. The cage armor modification tells us something important. The Russian soldiers manning these vehicles knew FPV drones were a threat. The command sending them into this corridor knew Ukrainian forces used ATGMs and pre-registered fires. The question isn't whether the threat was known. The question is why the assault was ordered despite the threat assessment. And that question points towards something that has appeared repeatedly in intercepted Russian military communications from the Donetsk sector throughout 2026. Call it command pressure override. Russian battalion and regiment commanders in the Donetsk direction have been operating under what Ukrainian intelligence assessments and intercepted communications describe as intense pressure to demonstrate progress, measured in meters of advance, in flags planted, in footage suitable for Russian information operations. In this environment, a third attempt on a previously failed axis is not necessarily irrational from the perspective of a Russian regimental commander who needs to show movement. It is catastrophically irrational from a military logic perspective. But organizational logic and military logic are not always the same thing. This is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface until you look at what Russian command culture produces under pressure. Doctrine says don't repeat a failed approach on the same terrain. Organizational pressure says produce results or face consequences. When those two imperatives collide, Russian formations in 2026 have frequently resolved the conflict in favor of organizational pressure. The slag-belt Gully had been attempted twice. Both times it failed. The third attempt was ordered anyway, and 20 BMP-3s drove into it at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning. The assault began at first light. Drone footage subsequently released by Ukrainian military sources, geolocated to the corridor by multiple OSINT analysts, shows the lead pair of BMP-3s entering the gully's eastern mouth and advancing approximately 220 meters before the lead vehicle triggered a mine. Based on the footage, the mine strike immobilized the vehicle, turret visible, tracks off, hull settled at an angle, without immediately destroying it. The second vehicle in the column stopped. This is the moment that sealed the fate of every vehicle behind it. In a 1.2-kilometer corridor 8 meters wide, with impassable slag slopes on both flanks, a stopped vehicle at the front is not an obstacle that can be bypassed. It is a plug. The column compressed. Vehicles 2 through 5 bunched within approximately 80 meters of the stricken lead vehicle as drivers attempted to assess the situation. From the ridgeline 800 meters south, 2 Stugna-P teams had been observing since the column entered the corridor. The first launch came approximately 4 minutes after the mine strike. The first Stugna-P impact was captured on drone footage from multiple angles. The missile struck vehicle number 3 in the column, the third BMP-3 back from the lead, in the right flank at approximately track height. The warhead penetrated and detonated internally. Within seconds, secondary explosions began as ammunition cooked off. The vehicle was catastrophically destroyed. The column had now lost its lead vehicle to mines and its third vehicle to an ATGM strike. Vehicles 2 and 4 were bracketed by burning hulls. The drivers of vehicles 2 and 4 faced an impossible geometry. Forward was blocked by the mine-struck lead vehicle, and the narrow width of the corridor meant that any attempt to pass the burning third vehicle would bring them within meters of a fire large enough to cook off their own ammunition. The column was, at this point, effectively halted. Here's where the Ukrainian fire control plan revealed its second layer of sophistication. The Stugna-P teams did not attempt to destroy every vehicle as rapidly as possible. They prioritized specific targets in a specific sequence. According to analysis of the drone footage, which shows the engagement developing over approximately a 60-minute window, the ATGM team struck vehicles in a pattern designed to maximize the column's internal chaos while systematically eliminating vehicles that might otherwise provide suppressive fire or serve as recovery platforms. Vehicles with visible cage armor modifications were targeted early. Vehicles positioned at potential reversal points, locations where a driver might attempt to turn and withdraw, were also prioritized. The result was a progressive constriction of the column's options. With each strike, the geometry worsened. With each burning hull, the corridor became more impassable. With each minute, the window for any organized withdrawal narrowed. Think about this for a moment. How many ATGM launches does it take to stop 20 armored vehicles in a confined corridor? The answer isn't 20. You don't need to kill every vehicle to stop the column. You need to kill the right vehicles in the right sequence to make the corridor impassable and eliminate any option for organized recovery. The 28th Brigade's ATGM teams understood this. Their fire control was not about maximum immediate destruction, it was about maximum geometric denial. By approximately the 40-minute mark, with 6 to 8 vehicles struck or immobilized in the first half of the corridor, Russian forces attempted what the drone footage suggests was an organized withdrawal of rear vehicles, those that had not yet fully committed to the corridor and remained within the eastern entry zone. This is where the third layer of the Ukrainian fire control plan activated. FPV drone teams had been held back throughout the ATGM engagement, waiting specifically for this moment. The recovery lane, the eastern approach track used by Russian forces to stage the assault, had been pre-designated as an FPV priority zone. As BMP-3s attempted to reverse out of the eastern entry, FPV teams launched a sustained series of strikes targeting the reversing vehicles and, critically, a T-72B3 tank that had been positioned at the eastern staging area as a recovery vehicle and potential overwatching gun platform. The T-72B3 was struck twice by FPV drones before it was abandoned. Footage of the strike shows both impacts landing on the vehicle's upper deck, an area where cage armor provides limited protection against a top attack trajectory. The crew appear to have evacuated after the second strike. The FPV drones used in this phase of the engagement were assessed by Ukrainian military sources as carrying modified anti-tank warhead configurations, RPG-7 PG-7 VR series tandem warheads fitted to FPV airframes. These are not precision-guided munitions in the Western sense. They are wire-guided or video-guided systems flown directly into targets by operators using first-person view goggles. Operator training, drone availability, and proximity to target all influence effectiveness. In this engagement, the confined terrain of the eastern entry zone, the funnel that had channeled Russian vehicles in, now channeled them out into the FPV kill zone. Over the 90-minute engagement window, Ukrainian military reporting confirmed 14 BMP-3 hulls destroyed or disabled within the corridor. OSINT analysis of post-engagement drone footage, imagery released by Ukrainian military sources and verified through geolocation by multiple monitoring groups, counted at minimum 11 clearly destroyed vehicles with visible internal fires or structural collapse. 3 additional vehicles showed damage consistent with mobility kills, track strikes, engine bay impacts, without confirmed internal fires in available footage. The T-72B3 recovery vehicle at the eastern entry brought total confirmed armor losses to 15 hulls. If you've been following this series, here's why this specific engagement matters beyond the raw vehicle count. 14 BMP-3 hulls at current Russian market replacement cost represent approximately 280 to 340 million rubles in direct equipment loss, roughly 3 to 4 million US dollars at current exchange rates. But replacement cost is only part of the equation. The 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade lost the equivalent of a reinforced company of infantry fighting vehicles in a single 90-minute engagement. At current Russian production and redistribution rates for BMP-3s, replacing that loss takes months. The infantry who were mounted in those vehicles, assuming full infantry loads, approximately 90 to 100 personnel, represent a casualty event whose full scope Ukrainian forces have not publicly confirmed, and which Russian sources have not addressed in open channels. Russian state media coverage of the Toretsk sector on May 31st made no reference to the engagement. This is consistent with the pattern observed after previous Ukrainian tactical successes in the sector. Silence, then a delayed narrative emphasizing Ukrainian losses elsewhere, then occasional acknowledgement of difficult fighting conditions weeks later. Intercepted Russian military communications from the hours following the engagement, fragments of which have circulated in OSINT channels, include references to significant losses and requests for medevac assets in the eastern Toretsk sector, consistent with a large-scale casualty event. What we don't hear in those intercepted communications, and this is the detail that stuck with us going through this material, is surprise. The communications suggest confusion, urgency, requests for guidance, but not surprise, which implies that somewhere in the Russian command chain, the possibility of catastrophic failure in this corridor was understood before the assault was ordered, and the assault was ordered anyway. Here's the take that may draw some criticism. The blame for the losses in the Toretsk Gully on May 31st does not rest primarily with the BMP-3 crews or the junior infantry commanders who led the assault. It rests with whatever Russian operational planning process approved a third attempt on a corridor that had failed twice in the face of known Ukrainian fire control preparations, under conditions where the terrain geometry made tactical flexibility impossible from the moment the first vehicle entered. Those crews drove into that corridor because they were ordered to. The failure is institutional, not individual, and that distinction matters, because institutional failure at this scale, repeated 3 times in the same location, tells us something about the state of Russian operational learning in the Donetsk direction that no individual act of bravery or cowardice can explain away. This is what the broader pattern shows, and it has been building for months across the Donetsk sector. Ukrainian brigades holding static defensive positions have progressively shifted their tactical posture from reactive defense to pre-planned attrition. The language used internally and reflected in how Ukrainian military officers have described their approach in vetted interviews is the concept of the kill sack. Terrain features that are predictable Russian assault axes, transformed through fire control preparation into zones where entry triggers a predetermined sequence of fires. The slag-belt gully east of Toretsk is a textbook example. The 28th Mechanized Brigade did not wait for Russian forces to attack and then respond. They identified the gully as a predictable axis, spent weeks preparing fire solutions for every significant terrain feature within it, assigned specific weapon systems to specific phases of any assault, and waited. The trigger was not a Ukrainian decision, it was a Russian one. The moment the first BMP-3 rounded the eastern spoil tip, the sequence was already determined. This represents a meaningful doctrinal evolution from earlier phases of the conflict. In 2022 and 2023, Ukrainian defensive positions were frequently reactive. Units responding to Russian assaults with fires called in real time, subject to all the fog of war degradation that real-time decision-making involves. By 2026, the most effective Ukrainian defensive units have moved toward what is effectively a pre-programmed attrition system. The terrain does the targeting, the fire missions are pre-registered, and the human decision required is simply the recognition that the triggering event enemy armor in zone has occurred. The practical implication is that Russian assault planners cannot easily defeat this system through speed. Faster entry into the gully doesn't help if the mines are already there and the ATGM teams are already in position. More vehicles in the corridor doesn't improve survivability. As May 31st demonstrated, it increases the density of the kill zone. Artillery preparation alone isn't enough either, because the Ukrainian teams use reverse slope positions and don't need to be on exposed ground during the preparatory phase. What could, theoretically, have disrupted the Ukrainian fire control plan? Genuine operational surprise, using a route that had not been pre-registered, dedicated suppression of the reverse slope ridgeline using systems capable of indirect precision fires, air support with the ability to sanitize the ridge before the ground assault, though Russian fixed-wing aviation has been extremely limited in this sector due to Ukrainian manpads and longer-range air defense coverage, or simply not entering the corridor at all and finding a different approach axis. The fact that none of these alternatives were employed on May 31st suggests that either Russian command assessed them as unavailable, or the operational pressure to force progress on this specific axis overrode the tactical calculus. Based on everything we know about the state of Russian operational decision-making in the Donetsk direction in mid-2026, the latter explanation is at least as plausible as the former. We spent considerable time going through the pre-attack staging imagery and the post-engagement drone footage frame by frame, and one sequence in the footage is particularly telling. Approximately 50 minutes into the engagement, after the main body of the column has been struck, the drone feed shows a BMP-3 at the rear of the corridor, one of the last vehicles to attempt reversal, stopping in the middle of the eastern entry track. Not struck, not on fire, just stopped. The vehicle sits motionless for approximately 40 seconds. Then it begins to move again, reversing. But those 40 seconds, that pause, that moment of apparent hesitation or decision, are a window into what it must have been like to be a vehicle commander in that position, watching the corridor ahead fill with smoke and fire, understanding that moving forward means death, understanding that moving backward means exposure to the FPV teams, and having no third option. That vehicle did reverse. It was subsequently struck by an FPV drone approximately 200 meters east of the gully entry. Based on footage, the vehicle was disabled but not catastrophically destroyed. Whether the crew survived is not confirmed in available sources. What do you think? Is there any version of Russian operational planning that could have made this assault work? The terrain geometry is what it is. The Ukrainian preparation was what it was. Comment below, because the answers from people who study this conflict seriously are always worth reading. And this is exactly the kind of tactical question where different perspectives illuminate different aspects of the problem. The May 31st engagement in the Toretsk slag-belt gully will, in time, likely appear in Ukrainian military training materials as a case study in pre-planned attrition defense. It demonstrates several principles that have emerged as defining features of effective Ukrainian defensive operations in the mature phase of this conflict. First, terrain analysis as a force multiplier. The 28th Brigade did not need to outnumber Russian forces or outgun them at the moment of engagement. They needed to understand the terrain better than the attacker and prepare fires accordingly. The outcome was asymmetric. 14 hulls destroyed at the cost of ATGM rounds, minefields, and FPV drone strikes because the preparation converted terrain disadvantage into tactical advantage. Second, fire control sequencing. The engagement was not a free-for-all. ATGM teams, minefields, and FPV teams operated in a coordinated sequence specifically designed to deny the column's geometric options progressively rather than destroying all vehicles simultaneously. This sequencing is what transformed a conventional anti-armor engagement into a kill sack. Third, Russian predictability as a Ukrainian asset. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the three Toretsk gully attempts. Ukrainian commanders can plan around Russian assault axes with increasing confidence because Russian forces have repeatedly returned to the same corridors after previous failures. Whether this reflects poor intelligence, command pressure to use approved axes, or a genuine underestimation of Ukrainian preparation is unclear. But the pattern is consistent enough across multiple sectors of the Donetsk front that Ukrainian defensive planning is explicitly accounting for it. Similar tactics have been documented at other points along the front. The dynamics echo, in a modern FPV drone-augmented form, the principle that drove some of the most effective defensive operations in 20th-century conventional warfare. Identify the terrain the attacker must use, make that terrain lethal, and wait. Rommel understood it. The Finns understood it in 1939 against far larger Soviet forces. The question is whether Russia's operational command in 2026 is capable of learning the same lesson that the Red Army eventually had to learn, that throwing mass at a prepared position on the same axis produces diminishing returns that eventually reach zero. The three Toretsk Gully attempts suggest, so far, that learning has not occurred. Whether attempt 4 will come, and whether it will be approached differently, is the next question for anyone tracking this sector. There are three things worth sitting with after this reconstruction. Could Russia have prevented the outcome of May 31st? Probably, but not by changing tactics at the moment of assault. Prevention would have required either a genuine change in assault axis weeks earlier, or the kind of operational security that prevented Ukrainian forward observers from identifying and pre-registering the corridor. Given the degree to which Ukrainian drone surveillance now covers the entire approach depth in the Toretsk sector, the latter option may no longer be available to Russian forces at all. What does this tell us about the trajectory of mechanized assault doctrine in this conflict? The BMP-3, despite being a capable system in other contexts, is fundamentally unsuited to forcing prepared defensive positions in channelizing terrain without dedicated engineering support, rotary wing suppression, and real-time electronic warfare coverage of opposing drone operators. None of those supporting elements were present in strength on May 31st. The lesson for any military studying this conflict, including NATO members, is that the combined arms coordination that doctrine says is required for mechanized assault is not optional. It is the difference between a tactical success and 14 burning hulls. And what comes next in the Toretsk sector? Monitoring the area in the weeks following May 31st, Ukrainian forces will almost certainly use the temporary disruption of Russian mechanized capability in this subsector to improve their own forward positions, extending observation posts, strengthening minefields on alternative axes, and continuing the methodical pressure that has characterized the 28th Brigade's approach throughout this period. The question isn't whether Ukrainian forces will press their advantage. The question is whether Russian command will respond with a fundamentally different operational approach or continue down the same road. History suggests the latter is more likely in the short term. But history also shows that operational learning can happen when the cost of not learning becomes high enough. 14 BMP-3 hulls in 90 minutes on the same corridor for the third time may be approaching that threshold. If you're here because you take this conflict seriously, because you want reconstruction and analysis, not headlines, subscribe to Frontline Truth UA. We publish OSINT grounded investigations on the Russia-Ukraine front every week, equipment losses, tactical reconstructions, intelligence assessments. The story of this war is still being written, one engagement at a time, and understanding each engagement in detail is how we understand the whole.